Hello and welcome as this time we come to the 33rd Sunday of the liturgical year. And let's begin first of all by simply giving what the readings will be. First reading comes from the book of the prophet Malachi, from chapter 3, verses 19 and through 20a, so it's just those two verses. Second reading from second letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. And then the gospel is according to Luke, chapter 21, verses 5 through 19. Now, as you know, over the last couple of weeks, we have been observing special, what we call feast days. We celebrated the Feast of All Souls. And then last time we celebrated the founding of the Feast of the Founding of the Lateran Basilica. So for those in the Catholic tradition who followed that, we missed some of the sections that are assigned to the 31st and 32nd Sundays of the year. For those of you who are not of that tradition, well, then you had these readings. So I thought we'd begin by because we are coming now to the end of our reflection on the Lucan year. There will be one chosen one next time, but it is out of sequence. But what we have been following is the sequence here. And here are the readings that we missed because we celebrated the feast. On the 31st Sunday of the year, the gospel was from Luke 19, verses 1 through 10, and was the story of Zacchaeus, who is best known because he was a toll collector, very rich, so we are told, Luke tells us. And again, keep in mind as we just kind of quickly review this, that these stories often reflect the emphasis that the Lucan gospel frequently, as we have noticed over the year, emphasizes. He was also short of structure, and so we have the delightful story that he wanted to see Jesus. He was in the city of Jericho. Keep in mind that the journey of Jesus now, and throughout this time we have noticed the journey theme, which is a major theme in the Lucan tradition, has found Jesus in Jericho, and there Zacchaeus, who is short of structure, wants to see Jesus, so he climbs the tree, and as Jesus passed by, Jesus stops, says, "Zacchaeus, come down. Tonight this day I want to have dinner in your house." Again, a great theme throughout the Lucan story of Jesus at meal with so many. And so he comes down, and then he says, well, if I have cheated, I give half of what I have to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone for any reason, I will restore it fourfold. So once again, that theme of what you do with the wealth and money that you have is a theme that belongs to the Lucan tradition. So that was the gospel account for the 31st Sunday. The 32nd weekend pictures Jesus and the Sadducees, and this is an interesting story in which, of course, the Sadducees were one of the major parties, at least we believe, that was active in the time of Jesus. And the Sadducees, unlike the Pharisees, did not believe in a resurrection of the dead. But they had interesting beliefs. And by the way, the Sadducees seem to have been in control of things that happened in Jerusalem, particularly. They were not, like the Pharisees, scattered throughout Palestine, but rather resided more regularly in the area around the temple in Jerusalem, or even lived in Jerusalem. And Because they did not believe in the resurrection, they did ask Jesus an interesting story, about a woman who marries a man. He dies. She marries one of his relatives. He dies, and she keeps marrying until 7 of them die, and then, kind of with a certain irony, I suppose, that only Luke could have, the widow dies. Now the question is posed by the authorities: whose wife will she be? So that's the kind of dilemma. Jesus gets out of it by saying, well, in the kingdom, in the future, there will be no marrying in this kind. And Jesus then goes on to say, you Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection, but listen, check the scripture, because you will find there is some indication of this. So that's the episode. Now, I'm not going into all of that, but just so that you can see. And that was chapter 20 of Luke's story, verses 27 through 38. So again, there is parts, rather, that are left out here, but I just mentioned that particularly for those who kind of have been following the story of Luke. Now today we come to, as I mentioned, chapter 21. The 3 Sundays, this one, or weekends, today, and then the one beginning the first Sunday of Advent, and in between is the celebration that we will have next time of Christ the King, have a certain unity. And some of the themes that are illustrated by Luke in the Gospel today will be picked up in the Gospel according to Matthew, who will be our guide beginning in 2 weeks. Now, I mention this because the material found in Luke here is also found in Mark and Matthew. In fact, they give quite extensively the material that is remembered in the gospel this time. In Mark, it is in chapter 13, verses 1 through 37, and in Matthew, it is in chapter 24, verses 1 through 35. So we won't go too much into the similarity, because we have discussed these in other years, and we'll pick up a little bit on this when we enter into the Matthean year. Important to notice that by the time that Luke writes his gospel, and I'm going to emphasize the importance of remembering something which we have stressed throughout this year, the importance of remembering that Luke wrote a twofold work: the gospel and then a companion piece known as the Acts. And although we separate them in this scripture because of the putting together of the 4 Gospels first, it is important to remember that the writer had in mind, as he was writing the gospel, also material that he includes in his companion piece called the Acts of the Apostles. Now, this work was written sometime in the 80s. It's generally believed in the year, around the year 85, which is agreed by many of the interpreters here as the time that he wrote it. But what is important to notice is that events which are narrated in the material we hear this time had taken place, namely the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction by the city, by the armies of Rome, a war that had happened, as we have talked about in the future, and we mention again here, a battle that took place with the Romans attempting to take the city of Jerusalem began in the year 65 and ended in the year 70. So it was a 5-year period. Now, it doesn't mean that the armies of Rome were continually trying to take the city of Jerusalem because during that time the emperor in Rome had died. A new emperor came into power. The man who was leading the army of Rome in Palestine was called home to become the emperor. So there was a hiatus, if you want, of concentration on the part of the Romans to take the city of Jerusalem. But they were stationed there, and they did keep the Jerusalem community intention-wise. And that also was part of the larger story of what happened here. Point is that by the time this event in the gospel that we're hearing was written, Jesus had already died, risen, and ascended. And what Jesus therefore foretells, and that's the point that we would make here, and it is an important structure that Luke, again, we have stressed over this year, is that one of the major images of Jesus is the prophet. The prophet is one, of course, as we had noticed on many occasions, speaks for the poor, for the needy. But in this case, Jesus is pictured as, well, not only being mighty in word and deed, but also in telling what's going to happen in the future. But here's the point that we're making. By the time that Luke writes this, the events that Jesus says are going to happen have happened. All right? Now, it is also true that in some ways the Gospel of Luke diminishes a little bit the idea that the future coming of Jesus is as imminent and to be as prepared for it as Mark and Matthew illustrate. In fact, one will notice that the emphasis that Luke often makes is we should be paying attention not so much of the future, although certainly that would be important, but we should be paying attention to the present. In fact, when Luke gives his account, for example, of the Lord's Prayer, he says, "Give us today our daily bread." So the emphasis is in that sense, and it is one of the characteristics unique to the Matthean story of the present. All right. Because as Jesus is pictured as reminding, and Luke, of course, now is helping us remember Jesus' words, that only God, because the question is raised, well, when will the end be coming? And the response that Jesus gives is only God knows the future date, or the one to whom God reveals it. But in a certain way, the gospel pictures Jesus as saying, really, nobody knows when it's going to happen. You can make your educated guesses, and maybe if God chooses to tell a certain prophet when it's going to happen, he will know. But that, again, is in God's hand. All right, so what Jesus now says is that those who accept his message are going to find themselves perhaps being persecuted for their beliefs in his message and in his ways. Now, and he says, well, you will be handed over to governors and authorities. There will be earthquakes, there will be famine, there will be things taking place in various places. I think it's important to notice that Luke knows these things have happened, but as if to kind of make sure that you get the message, you now have to read Acts. Because in the Acts of the Apostles, the very things that Jesus says is going to happen are noted. Now, were there persecutions of Christians? Well, I think perhaps it is important to notice, yes, in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke includes 2 men who die for their belief in Jesus. One is James, who in some way is pictured as the leader of the community in Jerusalem, who, because of Herod's influence, is martyred. And then, of course, the famous story of the martyrdom of Stephen, where Stephen is stoned for his belief, and as he is stoned says, "Look, I see Jesus in the heavens." And as he is stoned says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Again, words that are exactly the same words that Jesus utters when he dies on the cross. So Luke is importantly connecting the events that happened prior to the fall of Jerusalem to the word, what Jesus foretold. So you see, when Jesus is pictured as saying these things are going to happen, he has already, that is, Luke has already shown their fulfillment by looking at episodes that appear in the tradition of Acts. All right, so you get all of that. I think it is important, okay? Things did happen, but maybe not to the extent that sometimes is portrayed. If there was a persecution of the Christian communities between the time of Jesus' ascension and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, which would have been roughly a 40-year period. And again, that's interesting because Luke, very often, you remember, likes the number 40 and develops his tradition according to a numerical symbol that is popular within Israel's tradition, but well used and well remembered in Luke's story. Keep in mind, where we have the 40 days of Lent, we have the 40 days of Easter, although we add another 10 for Pentecost. But the point is that Luke, the writer, is certainly aware of his Hebraic or Judaic tradition, as well as addressing much of his message to those who are non-Jewish. So again, this is an opportunity to review a little bit some of the thinking with regard to Luke's story that we have noticed over many Sundays throughout this year. Luke, in his writing, is not expecting the apocalypse at any moment. Now, the apocalypse, of course, is that Jesus will be coming again in glory. An emphasis we will notice in the other 2 synoptics, but not stressed as much in Luke. Now, apocalypses, and maybe a little bit of background here, are often looked at as predicting the coming of Jesus in glory. But there's another way, and I thought this might be an opportunity just to reflect on this a moment, that some authors, in interpreting apocalyptic thinking, see it not as so much predicting a future, but as discursive protest material. In other words, what the apocalyptic thinking is doing is critiquing the monstrous ruling powers of the day and offering an alternative politics in which God saves and establishes God's people and even provides a blueprint for active resistance to these powers. So that from this point of view, and there are a couple of interpreters, a man named Richard Horsley has kind of supported this viewpoint that apocalyptic writing is not about the end of the world, that is, the destruction of planet Earth and the coming of Jesus riding on the clouds of heaven, but rather is predicting the end of empire, that in a certain way the Roman rule will come to an end. The evil forces and actions that Rome has been allowing to happen in Israel will come to an end. Now, I mention all of this. It is an interpretation. It is not one that is sometimes often used, but Jesus prophesies that the city of Jerusalem will be, and this again is part of the story, will be surrounded by an encamped army. People will be taken captive. The city will be trampled. Now, in a certain way, that is what happened, okay? So see what I mean is that by the time Luke writes this, those familiar with the activities that went on in Palestine knew what had happened. In fact, it begins, as we will hear, that Jesus is in Jerusalem, and people are saying to Jesus, look how nice the temple is, and how wonderful this area is. And now the words come, not a stone will be left upon another, when all this will be crumbled. Now it is true that when the Romans took the city of Jerusalem, one of the things that they did was to take down part of the wall of the temple and surrounding Jerusalem. I think we have shown on other occasions and talked about this, that recent discovery of things around where the temple in Jerusalem have discovered these stones. These stones are quite large, okay? Now, just so that you can imagine, about this size, about this height, and about, this depth. So they're really quite stones, and even to this day, they lie outside where the city, where the wall around the city of Jerusalem, around the wall of the Temple of Jerusalem had been. So not one stone will be left upon a stone. Well, now, whether that was to the exact degree that we're talking about true, we don't know. But again, Jesus prophesying about the city. Are the words of Jesus where say that those in the city would flee when the army of Rome surrounded Jerusalem. And there is some tradition which says that a certain group of believers in Jesus did leave the city, did flee, while the attempt to take the city of Jerusalem took place. It did, as I say, when Rome finally took the city by ramparts. I think we mentioned before what a rampart was kind of like a wooden elevator that was built, and it was tall enough so that they could roll it. It was put on rollers or pushed up by the soldiers against the wall of the city of Jerusalem. Then the soldiers went inside. That's why I say like an elevator, but they had to climb. The steps were there. It wasn't automatic. And then when they got up on the top, they would be slightly over the wall of Jerusalem, over the wall of the temple, rather, and thus would be able to come down and take the defenders. Somewhat, we believe that did happen. Again, those stories are also remembered in Matthew and Mark, but Luke makes allusion to this. All right. So that's Luke's version of the coming, but the importance, and again I go back to this, is that because Luke thought that the time, and he says, is near, but the end will not follow immediately, does put a different emphasis on this episode than the other two did. Because his point, and we've mentioned this now earlier today, is that now is the time. The time of the Lord is now. And although the tragedies that were mentioned, nevertheless, the kingdom, the work of the kingdom must go on. And the verse that we end with is, those who are persevere will save and gain themselves. All right, so just quickly, the first reading comes from the book of the prophet Malachi. And the last line that we will hear, Malachi, of course, does not have a lot of positive things to say. The book of Malachi is in the arrangement of the prophets in the Christian collection, is the last, because and these are the words that we hear as it ends this time: the day is coming. So that's where the emphasis is. And what is this day of coming? When the Son of Justice will occur. However, Son in Malachi is the physical sun, S-U-N. It doesn't take much to see how Christian writers kind of later on will interpret this a little differently to make the Son of Justice none other than Jesus. The second reading from Thessalonians, Paul argues that did you have this adage a little bit, that there is a place for everything and everyone, and everyone and everything has its place. Now, there is disorder that Paul finds, or the writer of 2 Thessalonians, who, just in passing here, is believed not to have been Paul. This is considered to be a Pauline letter, and although there are two letters to the Thessalonians, the first belongs to Paul. We believe that there were other letters, but which are not included in the collection, but this one is, and that therefore people should be aware that when things come, and there is a way to bring order to everything, okay? Because what I want to say is that in the time that the Thessalonian letter was written, minding the business of others was what everybody did. And watching over them, threatening them, ruining their reputation, publicly dishonoring them was all things that people could do. Now, we perhaps more would be inclined to say mind your own business, but what is important here is the emphasis that we would make on conscience, that we make these decisions, that we are the ones who decide what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. We are the ones who bring order into the patterns of life by which others and by which we ourselves also live. So I mentioned this a little bit. We haven't talked much about the Thessalonian letter, particularly this one, but I did want to mention that it is also probably written closer to the time in which Luke writes his gospel. And so therefore there's a kind of coming together of material and of ideas. Well, as we celebrate this week, may we, again, to the very best of our ability, keep in mind our call to live, as the gospel emphasizes, the message of the Lord today. Yes, the future we should be concerned with. And perhaps Luke saw that by living today, one was beginning to develop a future. And that future is narrated, as we mentioned, in the Acts of the Apostles. But it was spreading, and in conclusion, in the Acts of the Apostles, it should be seen that many saw the believing community in Jesus as the Messiah in a positive way. May we also see his message and live it in a positive way. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.